This video should give you a better understanding of the area of vocabulary and how it contributes to the major components of reading. So our learning objectives are as follows. We're going to be talking about receptive vocabulary and expressive vocabulary, morphology, the principles of semantics, domain-specific vocabulary requirements, oral language and writing, and effective instructional practices. Let's talk about the goal of receptive vocabulary and expressive vocabulary instruction. So first you need to understand the definition of receptive and expressive. So receptive is basically what you take in. So we do that through reading and listening. And expressive is what you put out, and we do that through writing and speaking. The way that I remember it is if I go to another country and I'm learning a new language, I will be able to read and listen and understand that language far faster and easier than I will be able to speak and write it. That's why so many of our ELL students are silent in the beginning. They're learning to understand or be able to participate in receptive vocabulary, that reading and listening. And then expressive takes some time, but not only with our ELL students, with all of our students. There is an article that talks about the relationship between the two that I've listed in your resources, so be sure to take the time to read this. How do the principles of semantics relate to vocabulary development? When we think of semantics, we think of meanings of words, phrases, and sentences. Synonyms, antonyms, homonyms, figurative language are all a part of this and can be troublesome for some students. Many times as teachers, we think of synonyms, some easier type synonyms that we want students to be able to use, like if you're tired, you're also exhausted. We want students to think of synonyms in a more broad sense and be able to interchangeably use them in their speaking and writing. It also helps if we teach students about connotations. So you can have a meaning of a word, if you take the word tired, exhausted, fatigued, all of those things mean relatively the same thing, but they have a different degree of meaning. Again, that really helps with their speaking and writing and being able to choose words that best fit how they want to communicate. Antonyms, on the other hand, are opposites. So sometimes we teach the easier opposites like up, down, fast, slow, right, wrong, but students need to know some opposites that they can really use both in their speaking and writing. I learned in my years of teaching that if a student really knows the meaning of a word, they can tell you the opposite or something that is almost the opposite of it. So we could talk about maybe the word accept. Well, that means to take something in or believe it. So a student could tell me that definition, but I knew that they really knew the definition if they could tell me that to refute or to refuse something really was the opposite of accept, and I could tell that they knew the meaning. So sometimes I did like word maps that included examples of antonyms, and it enhanced not only the students' understanding of the words, but told me that they understood what those words meant. So let's talk for a minute about homonyms or homographs, homophones, and homographic homophones. So we're going to start with homographs. So these are the words that are spelled the same, but they're pronounced different and they have different meanings. And I've given you a picture of a few, like present and present, bass and bass, minute and minute. So those are examples, and they can be very confusing to students. When they read them, they don't know how to pronounce the word, so it really blocks their meaning or their understanding of what they are reading. So teaching the various homographs, how they're pronounced differently and their different meanings are very important. Also, homophones. Now, these words are spelled differently, but they're pronounced the same way, but have different meanings, like right and right. These words can be confusing if in something that the students have heard. So if I'm reading a story out loud, or if I'm talking through something and I say you must turn it in the right way, students have to differentiate in their mind, which right am I talking about? R-A-G-H-T, which means it's correct, or W-R-I-T-E, which means it's something that I pencil or pen in. C and C, hair and hair, those are some more examples of those. These can be really, really tricky. They're known as homonyms, but also known as homographic homophones. These words are spelled the same, have the same pronunciation, and different meanings, like bat and bat. Fly is another one of those. So there are words out there that can be very confusing to students because they can be used as nouns and verbs, sometimes adjectives. So it's very important that we expose our students to these various types of words and enhance their understanding of this kind of vocabulary. In addition, figurative language can be very confusing for some students, especially our students with special needs and students who have autism, and our ELL students. They take things very literally and understand things very literally, so figurative language can be very confusing. So explaining these phrases are important to their understanding the vocabulary in the English language. Vocabulary needs to be part of your instruction. We cannot assume that students understand words, and we cannot assume that they can learn the vocabulary on their own. There are a couple of videos and articles that I have in the resources that talk about effective vocabulary instruction and will help you understand how to be an effective vocabulary teacher. Here are a couple of more of these types of articles or videos. The 5 best practices for teachers really go into some great effective vocabulary instruction. And the video from Ms. McCauley on how she gives effective vocabulary instruction in her junior high or middle school classroom will also be good for you. Here's another article entitled Teaching Vocabulary that also has some additional articles that you can click on depending upon your needs and how in-depth you want to go with your vocabulary instruction. So how does morphology relate to vocabulary development? First, we have to understand what morphology is. So really it's about pieces of words. So a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in a word. And meaning can be put into pieces of words through affixes, and we know these as prefixes, suffixes, and root words. There are 2 different kinds of morphemes. There are free morphemes, and these particular morphemes can stand alone. A lot of times, those are just our root words. Sometimes we can find a prefix or an affix that might be able to stand alone, but usually these are the root words. Bound morphemes cannot stand alone, and these are your prefixes or affixes that have to be attached to a word in order to create meaning. Here are some great resources to help you better understand morphology and how it relates to vocabulary development. So be sure to dig into these. Using oral and written language with vocabulary instruction is very, very important. Students need to be able to speak and listen and use vocabulary in various contexts. They also need to be able to write using the vocabulary to better understand and know how to use the words properly or the phrases properly. These two articles will give you some information into using oral and written language with your vocabulary instruction. They're both included in the journal The Reading Teacher, which is a practitioner-based reading journal. I think you will find them both very interesting. Now we need to talk about domain-specific vocabulary within our vocabulary instruction. If you teach a subject, even language arts, but other subjects such as math or social studies or science, there are vocabulary words specific to your subject or your domain. And usually we don't encounter those words out of that domain. And so it's very important for students to understand those words in order to understand the particular subject that they are learning or teaching. For example, the word photosynthesis. We don't usually hear that out in everyday conversation, but we're definitely going to hear that word when we're in a life science class or a botany class or maybe even a biology class. So it's very important that we teach these domain-specific words. Domain-specific vocabulary is discussed in these two pieces that I'm giving you. One is called Content Area Vocabulary Learning, and then the other is called Academic Vocabulary. So these words are used kind of interchangeable, and they both mean domain-specific vocabulary. Dig into these and learn about the importance of teaching domain-specific vocabulary. Now we're going to talk about instructional practices that help English language learners, but also all learners in our classroom, learn the academic vocabulary and content, or the domain-specific words. So again, I've given you some resources that will help you better understand instructional practices that can assist you and your students in learning the content area vocabulary. Be sure that you access these and take the time to read and incorporate them into your repertoire of learning teaching practices. Now, you have a lot of resources to access and a lot of learning to do, so go ahead, listen to this video again if you want to, but really dive into those vocabulary resources.